Hey CDA, and today I have a review for you for Echoes of the End. This is a double A game, which means it's not really a big budget game, but it's also not really an indie game, somewhere in between, made by a small Icelandic studio. And the main reason I wanted to check it out is one of my favorite YouTubers worked on it, so that's a good as reason as any to at least try a game out. Now, the game did get some very mixed reviews over time in the first few days of its launch, so let's dive into it to see if it is a game for you. Let's start about talking a little bit about those reviews, because as you can see in this graph, a lot of those reviews were in a couple of first days, and especially the negative ones have kind of died out since. And the main reason a lot of those negative reviews were given was because either one of two things. The performance initially was quite bad, honestly, but that has been mostly patched. I didn't have any problems in the last couple of weeks playing this game whatsoever. And the other half of the reviews seem to be mostly related to this game not being what people expected. I always kind of wonder why you buy a game if you don't know what it is about, but in this case I can kind of see where they went wrong. So let's actually start there. What is Echoes of the End in terms of the type of game? Now, the best way I can actually describe is, because I kept thinking this while I was playing it, is that this is basically Tomb Raider, or if you're not familiar with that, Uncharted, but in a fantasy setting. Your main character is basically Lara Croft exploring tombs, finding artifacts, and solving puzzles, while fighting some enemies here and there, just in a different type of world. Now, you are playing in this case as Rin, a young woman who has magical powers that are kind of a taboo, and as such grew up on the outskirts of civilization as kind of a protector of the magical wards to protect her country. Strange things start happening with those wards, and enemy soldiers are spotted, so you go out and deal with those things, and that will lead you into all kinds of different landscapes. Those are all looking awesome, by the way, so the visuals in this game are great, but it will also guide you into those runes for probably a lot better reason than in those other games I just mentioned, and have you solve puzzles along the way. And I think this is where a lot of people kind of went wrong, or at least in terms of what they expected out of the game. Because if you look at some of the trailers, there's a lot of focus on the open world. It's not really an open world, but it looks like an open world maybe. And some things about combat and the setting and stuff like that. But in the end, this game is a lot about solving puzzles. Again, very similar to Tomb Raider, where you will find yourself in some locked room in a dungeon or in a ruin, and you need to reactivate some sort of machinery so that the gate to the next room will open. Then you do some platforming, maybe find some enemies, and hey, look, there's another thing with statues that you need to align, or that there's a couple of wheels you need to turn in a certain order to get from A to B, to turn some other wheels to get from B to C, and so on. And honestly, I can see why not everyone might find that interesting, but if that's the case, then this is simply not the game for you. Similar to the Tomb Raider games, there's also some skill trees that you can level up on, so there's a little bit of a role-playing game element to this game, which is honestly really interesting. The skills that you do get do vary up the way combat is handled mostly, but other than that, it's not really the focus of the game. I do have to say that unlike, for example, again, Tomb Raider, this game has a couple of bosses that you need to fight at some point that are much harder than any of the other combat that you do. So I actually found that quite interesting. There seems to be a little bit of that role-playing game type of bosses in there that kind of come out of nowhere. There's only like a handful of them, so it's not the biggest part of the game. But still, if you saw some of those trailers, I can imagine that you think this is a completely different type of game. The magic, however, is really where this game shines, especially compared to some of the others that I just mentioned. The magic in combat is really fun. It never gets old to fling your enemies literally around the battlefield, slam them into each other, throw them on the ground, throw your sword to them and then pull your sword back, things like that. Especially once you get a couple of these abilities going and you get a little bit further in the game, you feel like a true hero, a powerful titan on the battlefield, basically. The magic elements are also kind of interesting in the puzzles, because they allow things to be done really different than normal. So there's some magical effects, like buildings repairing themselves depending on what you activate or falling apart. There are time jump elements to that. I won't spoil too much, but it's actually a really interesting way to do that. There's kind of like portal elements to it. Yeah, all in all, I think that is really well done. Another thing that I actually really liked about this game is playing as the female lead character. Now, this is a strongly written female character that doesn't really fall into the usual stereotypes too much, but is also not preachy or anything like that about all men are bad or anything like that. That some of the other games that recently came out kind of pushed up on us. This is just a interestingly written, strong female character, which I was actually hoping that we'll see a lot more of in the future. Now, I do have to say that if you initially start playing this game, she does come across as a little bit bitchy for no apparent reason. As it turns out, there is actually a very good reason why she acts that way towards other people initially, but it takes a while for you to find it out, so I can imagine that is a little bit off-putting if you're just playing the first few hours. Speaking of those first few hours, that actually brings me to some of the weaker points of this game, and again, I can't blame a lot of people for quitting within those first few hours, considering that is usually the time you have to get a refund. So, the first few hours of the game, especially I think the first hour, maybe even the first 2 hours of the story, is, in my opinion at least, the weakest part by far, and that doesn't help. The combat of the game also starts out really slow. I think one of the first fights that you do is literally a single enemy spawning. You defeat that one, then there's another single unit spawning, and you defeat that one, and then there's another single unit spawning. Not only did that make me think the game was bugged somehow or I was doing something wrong, it's literally the same enemy, I think 3 or 4 times in a row, and that just feels really weird and kind of wonky. Something else that feels a little bit wonky, at least especially early on once the puzzles are relatively short, so you move on quite fast, is that it suffers from the same thing actually Tomb Raider does. Loading screens are mostly avoided by the fact that you need to push open a gate or crawl under something or through a small area that you need to squeeze through. Those are quite clever ways to avoid the loading screens, but if you have to crawl under more or less the same type of gate like 7 times in a row in an hour worth of gameplay, it feels a little bit repetitive, and it happens a lot. Now, I guess a part of the reason for that is simply because this is a relatively small studio with a limited budget, so you have to kind of reuse some of your assets over and over again. And later on in the game, I actually didn't notice it that much. It still keeps happening, but there's a little bit more variety in how those loading screens are handled. But again, it's especially the first few hours of the game, this is really noticeable. And yeah, if that's the only part you play, I can blame you for trying to comment on that. Now, there's another couple of things that are not major issues. But for example, I kind of found it weird to be playing a character that is supposed to be kind of like the outdoors protector, scouting type, that can't actually swim. I mean, she will fall into a small puddle and drown. And for gameplay reasons and just making sure you can't just go anywhere, that sort of makes sense. But it was also annoying at certain parts of the game where there was just small, relatively small streams that I thought like, oh, you should be able to cross that most likely. And there might not be anything on the other side, but yeah, anyway. There's also little annoyances like you actually lose a little bit of health every time you respawn after you fall into a canyon or whatever. I actually don't know what the purpose of that is. It does make the next fight, if you fall a couple of times along the way and you get into a fight, that makes that fight quite harder because you might be starting out on half your hit points. And then you die in that fight maybe, and then you respawn and then you're back on full health. So then that makes me kind of wonder if I can just reboot this fight at full health. Why am I starting it out with half health just because I fell a few times? Not a major thing, it's just, I don't know, it's just a little bit weird. Now, if I can make one comment on this game that actually has nothing to do with this being a small studio, but I think it's just a weird choice, is the fact that you get a companion that is literally an old man. Well, not that old, but he's definitely a lot older and less, like, athletic than you are. And this guy has a grappling hook. And that helps him just basically jump to the other side of the canyon every time you need to solve a puzzle to get across, and he just jumps there. And again, it sort of makes sense, but a lot of these puzzles would have been so much easier if he just gave me the damn grappling hook and let me solve the puzzle that way. But anyway, game balancing things, I guess, but that was one thing that was, at least, again, early on, a little bit annoying. Once you get more and more powerful yourself, that difference actually gets a lot smaller, and you are doing things that he definitely can't do, so it makes more sense. It would just have been better if that made more sense early on as well. So after all that criticism, is this actually a bad game? Honestly, I don't think so. I actually really enjoyed playing it. I don't have that much time to play, so I don't play games that I actively don't like. The game also isn't too long, which you can either see as a good or a bad thing, but I like actually finishing games. And this game took me about 20 hours to play through on a normal difficulty. And you could definitely get more time out of it if you also go to collect all the collectibles you can find along the way. There's some achievements that you can try and go for. All in all, if you just do I think the average player would play through it, it will take you about 20-ish hours, I think. Also, the fact that those criticisms that I had, for example, about the old man being a better mountain climber than you, is compensated for by the fact that he is useful, but definitely not strong in combat. So that is an element where I think the companion really helps you shine. The story is also interesting once it gets going after the first few hours. And the last half of the game in particular has some pretty awesome scenes in it, both from a visual perspective as just a storyline and acting perspective as well. The acting in particular, I actually initially thought like, this is okay, but nothing to write home about. But the last few scenes contain some pretty solid acting. Once you can understand your character and know the background, she makes some pretty emotional but still interesting decisions. Yeah, I really enjoyed that part. In terms of difficulty, the combat is challenging, especially early on when you don't have that many skills yet. But because of all the mechanics and also just having to learn how to use those mechanics in your favor, it turns out to be pretty interesting. I do think there's a bit of a balancing issue with ranged units in particular. They are pretty strong, and so you basically just need to run straight for them at the beginning of a combat, take those out, and then deal with all the others on the battlefield after that. But honestly, that was very doable, and especially later on, once you get some real power going, you can just wipe entire battlefields of enemies off the table, and that's awesome. The puzzles themselves are fairly straightforward. They are complicated enough to make you think for a moment here and there, but not so hard that you're likely to get stuck on something for very long. I personally like that balancing. I don't like to have to look things up or just be completely stuck on things. But if you are looking for a real challenge in terms of those puzzles, this might not be the game for you. Another thing to note is that this game is made by an Icelandic studio, as I mentioned at the beginning, and there's definitely some of those influences in there. It's not just the standard orcs and trolls that you're fighting. Everything has an actual name in the world, and those names seem to be something Icelandic. At least I don't know what a Durthar is, or however you pronounce that. I'm not that good at pronouncing that, most likely. But it makes the world come with more alive than just orc number 530 that you've seen in every other game before that as well. Just as an example, but it's quite nicely done. All in all, I would say this is a pretty interesting first game from this studio, and I'm really hoping to see more. The setting is interesting, the story is interesting, the general mechanics have been quite original as well. There are some, generally speaking, just some good ideas in this game. The execution here and there could have been slightly better, so it's not gonna win any Game of the Year prizes or anything like that. But again, this is the first game by this studio, so I'm gonna give them a little bit of leeway on that as well. It also helps that the pricing is not that of a AAA game either. It's also not the cheapest game in the world, but all in all, I think it is pretty fairly priced for what you get out of it. I also think that if you really like, for example, Tomb Raider or Uncharted, you will actually like this game as well. If this kind of like puzzle platformer slash a little bit of combat thrown in it type of game is not your thing, yeah, this is not the game for you, definitely. This is not a game where it's all about the fighting and the combat and the skills. There's just mostly a lot of puzzles and lore in here as well. That said, like I said earlier in the video, I actually enjoyed playing it, and the further I got into it, the more I started to enjoy it. Now, ideally, that would be a little bit fast-tracked early on, but fact is, I was not bored at all, and I did finish the entire game and enjoyed doing so. So, hopefully that helps you in making your decision whether or not you should get this game as well. If you have any questions or comments about this game, let me know. And if you are still here, you are awesome, and I do hope to catch you in the next one.